going to be on here now, so we can call the meeting to order. I will call the meeting to order at 7:01. This is a special meeting of the Board of Education, the Milford Board of Education. It is March 16th, 2026. May we have a roll call, Ms. Flamme?
Yes. Jennifer Brown.
Ms. Brown is excused.
Okay. Megan Doyle.
Here.
Mary Claire Edmonds.
Ms. Edmonds is excused.
Okay. Nicole Flowers.
Here.
Adam Scobie.
Here.
Hannah Tedros.
Here.
Nicole Wilhelm.
Ms. Wilhelm is excused.
Okay. Cindy Boynton.
Here.
Susan Glennon.
Here.
Okay, looks like we have 7 members present.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
You missed me.
Oh, Tom Koba.
I think that makes 7 though with Mr. Koba.
Yes, I counted you, but totally forgot to call you. Sorry about that.
Very good. All right, so tonight we have representatives from our consultant, Perkins Eastman, with us to give us a presentation on their recommendations for elementary school. So I'll turn the meeting over to you. Just board members, I want to remind you that we shouldn't be using the chat feature. If you have questions, please use the raise hand feature. Mr. McCarthy, do you think it would be better if they waited till the end for their questions?
We're fine if you would like to ask a question, and I think conversational, and also we're going to show a lot of material, so probably better if you just go ahead and ask the questions, especially if they're clarifying questions,
Okay.
right? Wouldn't want to get to the end and then find out there was a misunderstanding. I'm just
Because you'll
looking
be
for
sharing your
where
screen,
Yes.
you may want to encourage board members to just jump in verbally because they may not see the raise
please
hand.
do. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, please.
Okay, well, let's just try to be cognizant of other people that might be talking when you and wait for turns. Sometimes that's hard on Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay, so we will turn the meeting over to you.
Now I just have to find out how to share. Does anyone know?
So Mark, I see you in here 3 times.
You do?
Yeah. So I
Great.
gave you co-host, but let me try the other ones too.
Yeah, Lauren and I are also marked tonight.
Oh, I see. Okay, great. But host tools, that must be. Don't see where I share.
If you go to the bottom of your screen
Yes.
and
The arrow up.
hit the bottom,
Oh, I see.
the thing will
Share.
pop up and says share.
Okay. Do you see?
There it is.
There we
it is?
go.
Okay, I'm
Yep.
going to start the slideshow. Get this. Okay, we're good? Everyone sees the slide. All right, great. Hi, thanks everybody. Sorry for that. A little bit of a delay here. So as I said, there's quite a bit that we're going to present. Please feel free to interrupt anytime, particularly if there's anything that's if we're going too fast or if there's anything that's hard to follow. We're going to look at the current. So tonight we're going to be talking about elementary schools. I will look at the existing conditions. We'll go through a couple of studies, different options that we looked at, and then look at next steps. So pretty straightforward. It's just, as I said, quite a bit of information. I think everybody knows us by now. Unfortunately, Patrick couldn't be here tonight, but Lauren and Mike and myself, who are all here in the Connecticut office for Perkins Eastman. So as I said, there's kind of 4 stops along the way. We've already looked at high schools and middle schools. So this evening we'll be presenting our initial thoughts on the elementary schools. And it was in the RFP to look at options of going from 8 to 6 elementary schools. So unlike the middle school, this isn't us starting from 8 and making, with sort of a blank page and saying, what do you recommend? There's already the thought from this board that ideally that 6 schools would serve the community best. So that's part of our assumptions from the beginning. So as I said, I'll go relatively quickly, but please stop me and talk a little bit about what we found from the existing elementary school conditions. So of course, as you all know, there are 8 elementary schools, more or less distributed across the
Hey,
city.
Hey, Mark, I'm sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. We're not seeing we're on, if you go into presentation mode or maybe swap your screens, we're still on the first
Oh,
slide.
oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
That's okay.
Huh. Let me see how to do that.
Or maybe can you share your other screen possible?
Yeah, I think I might have to.
He hasn't gone to presentation mode though.
I haven't.
Yeah. Maybe just try that.
I am sorry. I see presentation mode on my screen. That's what's confusing to me. Let me see if I can go back to. I don't want to exit out of the meeting completely.
I would stop sharing.
Yeah, I'm
That's
just looking. I don't have the taskbar because of what modem. I see what you're saying. Stop sharing. Okay, let me try this. Start. Apologize again. Share. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so sorry, I'm going to do this all over again. So if do you see the agenda slide now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So I'm just going to stay in this mode. It's a little bit, you'll see the previous slides, but I think it's safer than when I go to the slideshow, it switches screens and then I can't figure out how to get back. So as I said, we're looking at the elementary schools this evening, and we're going to go into some of the conditions. So we have 8 schools distributed, not exactly equal, but pretty well distributed across the city. And this is our starting point. I don't think I have to go into this. I think you all more familiar than we are probably about where all these schools are. But just as an overview, so um, of the 8 elementary schools, we have an enrollment of about 2,200 students, 2,250. All the schools are fairly aged vintage, right? So between 1950 and 1967. So in that regard, in this kind of conversation, they're somewhat equal in terms of their age and their conditions. So while the district has done a really great job of maintaining, and you've done some renovations and some smaller additions over the years, they they tend to rank very similar in terms of when we look at the facility conditions and what we would anticipate needing to be invested in the different buildings over the next 10, 20 years. The other thing that we find that um, there are some discrepancies in the facilities in terms of the what spaces are at each school. So not everybody has a dedicated gymnasium. Sometimes it doubles as a cafeteria. Sometimes it's a kind of general multi-purpose assembly space. Some of them are lacking in a library media center, or there are different sizes in different kind of support spaces, whether some schools have PT, OT spaces, some do not. So that kind of thing, which would not surprising when we look at schools of this age, just in terms of how much each one of these buildings is able to be updated to match a 21st century program. And then one note that two of the schools, JFK and Live Oaks, are projected to exceed their capacity. In fact, I believe Live Oaks is already at capacity. So, but on paper, these two schools are projected to exceed their capacity quite soon.
Can you clarify what that means, exceed capacity? Does it mean exceed capacity from the number of students, from a programmatic standpoint?
Yeah, it means
both?
what, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it, both.
Yeah, it means what the school is designed to host, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean you can't squeeze more in, but it's not the way the schools were designed to fit when we look at utilization and how many students in each classroom, et cetera.
So-
So I had that question too. When you look at the capacity report, is this, we're talking, my understanding is that the capacity can be a little misleading because it doesn't necessarily include all the special spaces that are needed in a school. Special ed rooms, OTPT, those kinds of things. Is that correct?
I think there's yes, in the sense that it's a little bit harder to put a factor on that, as opposed to in an elementary school, it's fairly straightforward, right? The students don't move around from class to class. So for the most part, you see a fairly high utilization rate in an elementary school as compared to a high school. But there is that nuance of when we get into support spaces, special ed spaces, which would have a different square footage per student, and then in an older building where it isn't designed, purpose built for that. So
Right.
that's a little bit harder for us to predict. But I know in talking with the superintendent that Live Oaks is currently at capacity.
Can I just clarify Ms. Glennon's question? So from
Yeah.
that standpoint, specifically at Live Oaks, you really can't accommodate for the fact that in a single room, there might be OT, PT, and another person in there. Because from a square foot standpoint, they may be the appropriate square footage, but they don't have their own independent adequate space.
Right.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
Yes.
please.
So that space, Miss Doyle, that you're talking about would be counted on capacity at, let's just say 20 kids. Because it is a classroom. So that classroom we counted as 20 children toward the capacity. But now formulaically, you have to subtract 20 students because that room is being used for occupational therapy, not to teach 20 children.
Okay.
So the OTPT is a specialized instruction space that was not in the designer's mind in 1950 something. So you have to take that 20 kids off of what typically would be capacity.
Right. And if you think about it, those are the same 20 kids that are in the classrooms, right? So it isn't, there isn't additional 20 students in PT and OT. They are coming there the same way we wouldn't count at an elementary school an art room, because that would be second grade class going to art for that period, right? So their classroom's empty because they all just went to art class, right? So that's the utilization factor that comes in.
So there's a limitation on there are parameters of what the limitation of the facility score, like the utilization is, because it's not accounting for all of those specialized services, if I understand correctly. It's much more a measurement of kids in a classroom, 20 kids per classroom, than it is the other spaces.
And
Right.
if you remember in the utilization presentation, Miss Doyle, long ago, there is a slide that is entitled, "Where did all the classrooms go?"
Mhm.
And it talks about the square footage that was planned for at one point in 1960, let's say, is different than the use of square footage today in 2024. I think the study was done 23.
Mhm.
So while the square footage hasn't gone anywhere, how we're using the square footage is not the same and would not apply to full maximum, how many kids can we get in this school formula. Does that clarify it, Ms. Doyle and Ms. Glennon?
Yes.
For me, yes, I think, to be just quite honest, I think there is some thinking in the community amongst some that we can just close some schools and squeeze all the kids into the remaining schools. And those of us on the board know that that simply is that's not a fact, because of the way that the schools are being utilized. So you can't just look at the capacity report and say there's plenty of room in these elementary schools. There really isn't, because of some of the other needs within the building that the classrooms are being used for.
And I think Live Oaks is a great example of that. I think Mr. McCarthy mentioned that on paper, it looks like it's a 77% utilization rate.
Mhm.
And for those board members that did the facility study, there isn't 25% of space that's empty at Live Oaks.
Plus
Um,
the tour we just went on as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. That's what I meant.
Yeah,
Thank you
okay.
for fixing my
Right.
language. So on that tour, you saw that there wasn't 25% of classrooms open. So certainly if we were only to close 2 schools and do nothing different, we would have specialized instruction on carts. And in some way, I hate to say this, but sometimes you end up in a hallway or in a network closet or something less adequate.
But also, to be clear, in terms of the purpose of our study and this master plan, we are also looking at having spaces that are appropriate for 21st century needs and learning. So hence the reason why we are looking to expand some schools or build some new schools versus just leaving everything open, because our schools are old.
And there are programmatic deficiencies, as you're
Right.
mentioning.
Yeah.
And from an educational perspective, and Mr. McCarthy could certainly speak architecturally, our rule of thumb is always looking at 85% capacity, not 100, because 85 allows for that innovation and that programming for the future, adding more specialized programming, like for students with special needs, and for the future in the event that Milford experiences an enrollment bump. So you're not going to build for 100% capacity from at least an educator's perspective. I don't know, Mr. McCarthy, in your experience, what your industry standard is in that regard.
Right, agreed. I think 2 things. One is there's no building in the world that is 100% utilized. That never can happen, right? Because somebody has to, people move around from room to room. So just to be clear, an elementary school that's at a utilization of, let's say, 80% is a well-functioning school. But on top of that, we're trying to build in some wiggle room. Again, it's not necessarily because of there's a modest expectation in terms of demographics, but it never works out. And this is really in the educator's world, that you can perfectly level out. Every classroom has 20 students, and they're all distributed around town exactly the same way. So otherwise you'd run into a problem where as soon as you had 1 kid, you'd have to add, if 2 kids show up in September, suddenly you have to add a whole nother 2nd grade that you didn't anticipate because you had no wiggle, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. Please stop me because we have a slide like this per school, but this is a kind of a snapshot for each school in terms of what we see in terms of the current conditions, what we're looking at. So something like CAF Penn, built in 1955, it has a capacity, so it was designed, or I shouldn't even say design, it has the capacity for 338 students. It currently only has 260 students. It has a utilization rate of 77%. The other thing here is that the facility condition index, so I think you've heard Patrick talk about this. When you see a building get above 40% in the FCI, that's where you start to think about whether it's really worth it to continue to invest in that older building or whether it's a better idea to build new. So that's kind of a rule of thumb that amongst facilities people. So you see, and you'll see tonight, all of your schools, I think, are above that 40% mark. And then just an idea about, as I said, the demographics, the 10-year projection shows relatively stable. So if you go through at JFK, again, you have an FCI of over 40%. In this case, an enrollment that's much closer to capacity. So a pretty good utilization rate at 85%. Sorry, I skipped one. Live Oaks has a very high FCI. So certainly one that you want to think twice about major investments in that. But on the other hand, it has pretty good enrollment and a good utilization rate. Matheson, similar tale. Maybe when we look out to a 10-year, it gets over that 40% mark. In this case, it has a pretty good capacity of 458, but only enrollment of 324. That's what gives us the 71% utilization rate. Meadowside is Meadowside's a pretty small site, only 6 acres, and a low enrollment of 265. And the superintendent can speak to that in terms of when we're looking at enrollment, when we get down below 300, there start to be some concerns about the efficiency of a school that size. Not to say that, of course, class size matters. Smaller class size is proven to be important, but an overall school size is something different. When we get into this lower than 300, it becomes difficult to offer the full set of programs and the staffing that required for the efficiency at a low enrollment number. An orange, similar tale. When we look out 10 years, we're above the 40% FCI, has a enrollment of 400 at a utilization of 79%. Orchard Hill, similar story. Again, enrollment of about 363 with a capacity of 87%. Again, built in 1961. And then Pumpkin Delight, again, has a small enrollment, a fairly high FCI, although we know there's been some recent investments there. So that doesn't necessarily show up in the average of the building, but certainly something we'd start to take into consideration as something that the community has invested in fairly recently. So very similar data when we look across the 8 schools. So then we start to look at how then do we, in a scenario where you're looking to go from 8 to 6, what's the criteria that we start to look at that would start to give us some sense of what would be the best candidates for closure and what are the schools that we want to keep.
Mr. McCarthy,
yeah.
I just want to reiterate, I don't want to harp on this, but
Sure.
in talking about capacity versus enrollment of students, that's again, in looking at a school that might have a differential of 100 students, it doesn't mean we can fit 100 more students in that school, correct? Because we might be using those classrooms differently.
Yes,
so I just
that's
want to
right.
make sure that's really, really clear to
Right.
people.
Again, 100%, it would never be 100%
Right.
utilization. That's not possible. As I said, if all the 3rd graders go to art, then their classroom's empty, right? So that's where you get into the utilization rate, right? If they go to gym or they go to lunch, it's not like another 2nd grade class comes into that classroom.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
And we're not counting, Ms. Glennon, like at Orchard Hills, high utilization rate, but we also have behavior programs there. We have
Correct.
special
That's my
programs.
point, is that, yeah, there's other classrooms are being used for other reasons.
Yes.
So it's not like we can just fit more kids in the school.
Right,
So
and
it's almost like enrollment and utilization are not synonymous. That might be a good way to put it. So your enrollment may appear to be low, utilization maybe, so you can't put more kids in there because physical classroom spaces are being used for other purposes. So,
Can I ask, and we're looking at some of these utilizations as well, because we're not really accounting for preschool because it's not part of our regular enrollment, K through 5. So we're not accounting for those classrooms either. Correct?
that's correct.
right,
This is looking at just the elementary school population. I think that's also goes into the thinking about what we should be designing to, right? Because typically that's where, you know, elementary schools are where you would expand offerings for pre-K.
Correct.
so Ms. Doyle, in the enrollment report that we gave you on October 1st of 25, we reported 61 preschoolers at Live Oaks. That's not what, is being counted overall, I don't believe.
And then just one quick question. You might have mentioned this already, but what is the ideal capacity?
Okay, so capacity and utilization, two different
Yes.
things, right?
Okay, so I see capacity
We're
is
gonna,
more
we
effectively,
have
but
not,
like,
but we're gonna look at that. Well,
Okay,
actually,
great.
this slide does say that, right? So when we're looking at consolidated to 6 schools, we would be looking at a capacity of around 450. Now that might go up a little bit depending on what the district is looking for in terms of goals for preschool. But in terms of the elementary enrollment, if we were sort of balancing the tires, right, over 6 schools, we'd be looking at a design capacity of around 450 students. So instead of the fluctuation you have now, it would be, you know, fairly equal across all 6 school buildings.
And
Is
then
that,
my next,
go ahead.
yeah, that's helpful. Sorry, I didn't see it on the slide. Then my
Yeah, it's
next question is like, what is the ideal utilization?
in the 80s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So thanks. That was starts off this slide. So that's kind of some of the basic assumptions, right? Um, uh, and the other factors we're looking at is the size of the property. So there's quite a variation amongst your existing school buildings. We were also assuming that given some of the studies we had done for the middle and high school, that we're looking at maintaining the, you know, reusing the existing elementary schools, that it wasn't likely that we were going to find new sites to build on. We're looking at some of the demographics and the location. So looking at distributing those 6 as equally or balanced as we can across the city. And yeah, that's so the access between the east, west, and central areas. The reasons why 6 is an advantage. There's, as we started to talk about already, there's an improved operational programmatic efficiencies. So, you know, there's just a greater efficiency when we have 6 schools being able to offer those additional programs. And just frankly, how capital dollars can be utilized or spread across those 6, rather than some of the inefficiency of having 8 schools, each one of them having to maintained and staff and so forth. Some of the challenges then are redistribution of enrollment, who goes to what school, which I'm sure we'll talk about that as we go through some of these studies, because it wouldn't simply be, as you'll see, well, let's um, close this school and then all those students just go to the school that's closest to it. It's a bigger district-wide study, excuse me, which is kind of beyond the scope of our study, which would say, well, we'll look at these fresh, right? Because now instead of having a variety of size schools, of 8 different schools of different sizes and different vintages, ultimately, if we were have ideally 6 schools, all of them with the ability to take 450 students, that would be we redistribute students across the city. So inevitably, some students would have increased travel distance, but I think on balance, it's still a very reasonable amount of travel distances. I think we're looking at certainly less than 2 miles for any student to get to their school. Oftentimes, and I don't have all the breakdowns of those numbers, but oftentimes much less than that. So the
Can
two
you just
schools.
say that
Sure.
again? So you're saying that basically when you did what you did like at the middle school is that where the students are located currently, most would be within 2 miles of an elementary school.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think often many less than, a mile or less, but no one greater than 2 miles from the school. Again, if you're not based on the districting lines now, but looking holistically across the whole district. And so the two that we were looking at, and we'll go into a little bit of the whys of that, are Meadowside and Calf Pen. I think a lot has to do with the size of the site and the size of the enrollment at those two schools, as well as the access to other schools in the area. So looking at it as kind of an east-west central division, we have 2 schools, JFK and Pumpkin Delight on the west side. We have Orchard Hills and Live Oaks on the east side, and then Mathewson and Orange centrally located. So those two made the most sense to us, looking at it in terms of, as I said, the condition of the building, the enrollment, and the size of the site. I'm going to go through those. So if I looked as I said, looked at Calf Pen and Meadowside. The Calf Pen appears to be a decent sized site, but as we've talked about before, much of the site is wetlands and in a flood zone. So we really couldn't build on most of that site. So it becomes very challenging to reuse that site compared to some other sites in town that we could look at. Same thing for Meadowside, very small site. Access isn't great. So along with the enrollment, both of them are under 300 students. So given that, along with the proximity of other schools in the area, seemed to make the most sense. The other thing we looked at, which we talked about similarly with the middle school and the high school, is we needed to develop what a 21st century elementary school for about 450 students would look like. So what that told us, with purpose-built space like we were talking before, right? So dedicated special education rooms, dedicated gym, cafeteria, right-sized and built for today. If we were starting that today at 450 students, we'd have a school that's about 70 to 80,000 square feet. So that's our starting point in terms of at least ideally looking at how would we get there given your current facilities. So we looked at 2 different studies both of them based on the idea of keeping 6 schools and closing one on the east side and one on the west side, one being Calf Pen, the other Meadowside. And the 2 studies, the difference really was, could we do something where we're consolidated to 6, but we're doing renovations, so very high level renovation, going in and really moving walls around and as we say, sort of renovate as new. And also because when we get to those 6 schools, and somebody asked that question before, we're also looking at adding to those schools so that we do get that purpose-built programmatic space. So that study 1 is renovate and add. Study 2 was what if we did all new buildings? So we'll look at both of those.
Can you just provide us a quick, how many square feet currently are our elementary school buildings?
I can in 2 slides. So as I said, so we'll look at study 1. So I think these are, you know, we talked about this a little bit already. Certainly we've done a lot of renovation and additions to schools, and there's a lot of great things we can do. So they're absolutely in a renovation scenario. We can improve operational programmatic efficiencies. We can get to excuse me, right size enrollment, more, support more programmatic variety. We can get to a more modernized facility. There's still some limits to what we can do when we do renovations in terms of the efficiency and the operational of the building itself. So while the rooms could be renovated to be a better fit, it still is an older building, so it wouldn't be as operationally efficient. There's also, I think, a big factor is how we actually phase that. So if these schools remain in session, how much we can do over the summer, how much we can selectively go through and sort of wing by wing renovate. It does take a lot longer and it is a lot more disruptive. Not impossible, but that is one of the downsides to looking at a renovation scenario. So I think this was the question you had. So this looks at of those 6 schools, the existing square footage. So JFK at 47, Live Oaks 45, Mathewson and Orange and Orchard a little bit bigger, and Pumpkin Delight. So if we're looking at that target of 70 to 71,000 square feet, it gives you an idea of how much area beyond renovation that we would have to do. And you'll see there is some selective demolition involved. So it gets a little bit nuanced here, but it gives you a rough sense of, existing versus additions to get to that like new 450 student elementary school. So at JFK, again, it would be something like this, which would be adding a dedicated gymnasium and a 2-floor classroom wing. We would have to reconfigure parking, but it is possible to do that. And then you can see the majority of the school is a renovation scenario. We do have a rough order of magnitude cost for each one of these. So this one is about $56 million. Sorry, I skipped one. At Live Oaks, you see in the red dashed line, that would be a demolition. I believe that's a demolition of a 1-story piece, or that's not the gym, right? Pretty sure it's a 1-story classroom wing. That's just not very efficient. So if we were to take that down, we could come back with a 2-story classroom wing, which would get us a lot more capacity in the same more or less the same footprint, and then add a dedicated gymnasium. And this was coming in at about $68 million. And those are today costs. It's hard for us not knowing exactly the sequence of these things, so we didn't get into escalation and that sort of thing, which can certainly impact cost estimates. At Mathewson, again, a combination of additions with some selective demolition in order to be able to increase capacity. Oftentimes that's because either the school doesn't have a full-size gym or they have 1-story classroom bar. And typically, if we were starting today, we would do 2-story at an elementary school level, which is much more efficient. So at Orange, similarly, adding a gym, 2-story classroom wing, selectively demolishing a one-story classroom wing. And again, similar scenario. So at most of these schools, it is possible to do a renovation and addition with some selective demolition. A lot of that has to do with that many of these school buildings are one story, typical of this age building. And that's just, it's less efficient, the more travel distances, takes up more of your site. So in order to increase capacity without expanding the site, we would recommend doing two-story additions. And then finally, at Pumpkin Delight, again, this is one that you had recently invested in renovations, so a little bit less in terms of the additions needed, but still some classroom additions along with the new gymnasium. So it's all, they're big numbers. I appreciate that the cost of construction and is it can be pretty surprising, but it is possible to do a renovation and addition scenario. As I said, I think really for us, the thing to keep in mind is all of that sort of light, sort of pinkish tan color would be renovations. So these would take over several years to get there, and we'd have to phase, and not everything can be done over the summer. We do a lot over summers, but inevitably there would be some disruption and for a few years in order to get through all of this kind of renovation. So I think Mike's going to take us through our second option, our second study.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Hey, everyone. Again, Mike Berger, not Mark McCarthy, because that's what happens when he forwards you the invite. You all become Mark for the evening. Could be worse. That's okay. So as Mark said, so we're going to compare, the renovate like new with additions to new construction. But we're also comparing the same exact program. So that same 450 plus or minus student enrollment, the same size square footage, but we'll apply that to new construction on each of these sites. Still the same scenario with 6 elementary schools at the end of the day, and still suggesting at this point CAF, Penn, and Meadowside to be the 2 schools closed for the same reasons that Mark just presented. I think there's some really obvious reasons why new schools are more beneficial, right? I think they are perfect purpose-built facilities to the needs of 21st century education. You get dedicated gymnasiums and assembly spaces and cafeterias. Most of your schools now have a shared multi-use space, which shared between classes and after-hours use. Modern media centers, learning commons, flexible classrooms with modern technology and flexible technology, arts and STEM spaces or dedicated spaces, but also just the general wellness, student wellness, and counseling areas that some of the schools lack currently. Also improve site circulation and building security. That passive security measure and design that's really kind of cooked into new school design. We'd be able to implement that in a purpose-built schools. The benefits, it's a long-term value, right? You're investing. As you see, the costs obviously are going to be a little bit higher first time costs. But you get long-term facilities that'll last, 50 years plus across the board, right? Across the entire district, entire city. These are more efficient buildings, as I mentioned, they're purpose-built. Mark mentioned, reducing the footprint, designing more compact buildings on the site, allowing for more flexible open use within the site. Operational efficiency, these buildings are going to be designed with the best technology. So the building envelopes are going to be robust and very super efficient, including the windows, the roofs, the mechanical systems. Everything is kind of cutting edge modern materials and methods, which in turn leads to lower maintenance costs, right? And lower operational costs for the long term. As I mentioned, one of the downsides is the potential higher upfront cost. And as Mark mentioned, depending on how the city depends to implement the sequencing, escalation it can compound over time depending on how long it takes to implement the entire master plan. Next slide, Mark.
Yeah, I'll just add, and I think Mike touched on this a little bit. We also have the potential to be a much more sustainable when we do a new building. So in terms of operation costs, oftentimes now we're looking at schools that are all electric, potentially even net zero. Those are much more obtainable things these days. And certainly if we're projecting out 5 and 10 years plus, we would be looking at much more sustainable approaches. That's difficult to do in a renovation scenario.
Thanks, Mark. And we don't really get into it in this, but we typically share like a classroom orientation, for an east-west classroom orientation. So the corridor runs east and west across the site. So classrooms either face north or they face south. If you take that orientation, which is the preferred orientation, solar orientation, versus a north-south classroom orientation, where classrooms either face east or west, the building performance and operation can be improved by up to 8% with an east-west orientation. So you'll see in some of these diagrams, we're already starting to take a look at how a new building can be oriented to maximize the solar orientation and just be a more sustainable and better functioning school. So thanks, Mark. So this scenario, this is one option to consider to kind of maximize flexibility as you implement these renovations and/or additions to the schools. And we're going to look at JFK and Live Oaks as suggesting that these sites appear to allow us to build new buildings, a new school on the site while the existing schools remain operational. So the students will not be displaced during this first phase of construction. The final phase, regardless of the sequence of projects, Meadowside and Calf Pen would most likely be the last buildings kind of come offline, so they'll remain online during the duration. They can be used as swing space, as other projects, as schools are either renovated or knocked down to create new projects. You still have the flexible use of Meadowside and Calf Pen during the duration of the projects. Next slide. So take a look at JFK. As Mark said, this is something that we do all the time, quite often, on a site. This seems like a really reasonable site, great candidate to construct a new school. You notice that east-west classroom orientation, as I mentioned. But the school, obviously, we'd have to dig in much closer and obviously create a very safe site for the students, the faculty, and the surrounding neighborhood. But it appears that you can construct a new school while the existing school is in session, creating a clear separation between contractor area and student area. Once the school is completed, the students and faculty will move into the new school, and then the school will be demolished, remediated, demolished, and then any of the site work would be finished. And you see the bottom line on the left-hand side, the rough order of magnitude is just over $78 million, which includes, the demolition of the existing school, as well as the site costs. Excellent. Let's skip that one.
Yeah.
Thanks. Next one is Live Oaks on the east side of the town. We see some opportunities for it. It does appear a little tight at first look, but we see some opportunities for contractor access to get to this location. That's why we're suggesting this. Obviously, any of these would need farther and deeper, more robust exploration and study. But it appears we can build a nice performing, compact, really efficient building behind the existing school. Just as in the previous JFK, once the building is complete, students and faculty move in, they demolish the school and complete the site, kind of improving the site circulation as well.
Sorry.
No worries. Thanks, Mark. And also we're improving, talk about building security is one, but also site security and safety, how parents and students arrive at the school for drop off, the really clean separation of car and bus and walkers and students arriving on bike, and how they approach and arrive at the front door of the building is something that is a great opportunity with these new builds. Next. So Mathewson. It appears, because of the shape of the site, a decent amount of wetlands off to that dark green, kind of forest green on the back of the site is wetlands. So although some of the sites might look great on paper with the acreage, 13.5 acres, once you start to layer in wetlands and access and actually the shape of the sites, some of these become quite challenging, right? So this is one that appears that the students would move off-site to a determined location. The building would be demolished and a new building would be constructed on site. Next. So same with Orange Ave. This one, the site does appear to accommodate. We see a challenge with contractor access on this one. This one we could study a little bit harder. There just doesn't seem to be enough room in the south part of the site to allow full contractor access to the back of the site to allow for adequate staging and clear enough and safe enough separation between school use and construction use. So this is another candidate where we would suggest studying demo and replacement. Orchard Hills. I think this is a very very challenging site. So this one I think is a prime candidate for a knockdown and rebuild. And you notice that the costs on most of these are very very close. Obviously we dig in closer. There's some unknowns that we're being a bit conservative with the unknowns of demolition, unknown site conditions. So as any of these studies move forward, obviously that number would fluctuate depending on the findings, right? Next slide. And the last one is Pumpkin Delight. We know that the city has recently invested a decent amount in the additions, the gymnasium, kind of the middle portion, the front of the existing school. So this is one that we might take a harder look at, say, can we preserve some of that new, the recent investment that the city has made, but make some additional improvements, make classrooms and other spaces we call it kind of a hybrid. You're preserving some of the valuable portions of the building that do have a much longer lifespan, that are more modern and in line with 21st century, but demolish the rest of the building. And then in the end, it functions as a new building. So this one, you can see there's a rough order magnitude of the hybrid version, which is around 65 to 69, and then an all new kind of falls in line with that 78 million.
In this scenario, and staying in this six new school build scenarios, each school seems to be, well, I think the easier way to ask this question is we have 8 different schools, and if you go in them, they all look almost similar, like they were copy and printed across the district. And that doesn't seem to be the case, that it seems to be a better situation to design specifically for each state for orientation and all of those, and that those efficiencies that we can be gained from that are better than using the same kind of plans over and over again. Because we're not accounting for other issues that may be at the site.
Yeah, I think that it's difficult to do that. I mean, you see that you're talking about having kind of a prototype so that we see that in larger sort of Midwestern districts where you have big sites and lots of area and that's nice, nice big flat sites, because the sites are all a little bit different. I think there's some intentional similarities you'd want to do, right? Where and we've certainly done that, where we've kind of sister schools so that there is some similarities from one to the next, but frankly the site conditions are so different that it's hard to really get, it's hard to prototype exactly the same every time.
And then I noticed that all your, excuse my cat, is that all of these are 2-story buildings in most aspect in each of the scenarios. Can you describe, I know there are limitations of what can be on an elementary school versus what first floor and second floor, and then can you describe what efficiencies are provided by 2 floors versus 1 floor?
Sure. Yeah. I think when we look at the youngest students, we want to be on the first floor for preschool, kindergarten, first grade, probably, given the choice. I'm not sure that we are bound by code at the elementary level to stay on the first floor, but certainly those younger students we'd want on the first floor. But in terms of building efficiency, I think 2 floors is really at an elementary school. Occasionally we'll do 3 floors, but I would find 2 floors to be the most efficient. It's not a ton of stairs. At this age group, they're not traveling a lot, so it's less of an issue in terms of, it's usually very particular times of day when they're moving to specials or moving to lunch or gym class, that kind of thing. So 2 floors does allow us to not, I think, Mike, you have a kind of rule of thumb. It doesn't make the building half as big, but it does save a lot.
So I actually want to piggyback on that because I have a lot of concern over 2 floors for elementary school. I know that we do have Pumpkin Delight that is currently a 2-floor building, and I know that there's challenges there. I mean, for one thing, it requires then an elevator in every single building.
True.
And I don't know if you'd need an elevator, like just looking at the Pumpkin building, for instance, where the 2 floors are spread out. Does that mean there has to be 2 elevators? And I think in Connecticut, I believe there are specific limitations as to what can be on a second floor. I think pre-KK and grade 1 must be on the first floor.
Okay.
That's correct,
So
yeah.
that means that you know, you also need to have then all your specials have to be on the first floor, all your special ed spaces, resource room, OTPT, your media center, all those spaces need to be on the first floor as well. So one question I wonder is would these designs accommodate that, having all of those spaces on the first floor and then second, third, and what would it be? Second, third, fourth, and fifth grade on the second floor. And then my second question would be, do the sites preclude a 1-story building? I understand what you're saying about efficiencies, but just generally, I work with little kids, and I know
Yeah.
I have some concern about all 2-story buildings.
I
Just as a
think,
general comment.
I think looking at this one, you can see, I think there's certainly potential for having more 1-story. But I think I'm not sure if Anna had said this earlier, but I think you had mentioned to us at one point, ideally having sort of cohorts of 4. So 4 first grade, 4 second grade. So I think when we're looking at, we don't really show that, but Mike can speak to that, but typically we're looking at clusters. So yeah, agreed that one of these wings would have the specials on it. The other one would have the pre-K through 1, and then on the second floor is where you'd have the 3, 4, 5 or something like that. But that's where you get into it. It's not that the building's half as big or the footprint's half as big because of all those reasons that you've mentioned, as well as gyms are higher and cafeterias and kitchen and all these things that need to be on the first floor.
I'll jump in and mention that we are talking, Ms. Glennon, about a larger school building. So if we go with a 4-section model, now we're talking about 24 classrooms being spread out across 1 floor, plus all those specials, plus a gym, plus et cetera. But second, we're really diving into the weeds at right now where we don't really need to, because we're not at design or ed spec phase. These are just preliminary, what could possibly happen on land. So because Perkins is recommending 2-floor, that's getting a little ahead of ourselves in that regard.
Yeah, I
But-
understand that, but I guess, so my general question is, in terms of some of the suggestions, if you're gonna knock down a building and use swing space to move the kids, then you can probably do whatever you want in terms of, the building space, as long as the site will accommodate it. So we've said that some of the sites are smaller than others. So do we have sites that, in order to expand the building to the square footage that we need? I mean, we're talking adding, I think maybe like 12.
20,000 in some cases.
So, that's a considerable amount of square footage. So are there sites that
Yeah.
wouldn't accommodate that with a 1-story building? I mean, I think that type of question is something that, needs to be just generically needs to be considered. Looking at the JFK, for instance,
But
could
I
we
think
even
we
do
just
what's
need
being,
more.
could
I
we
think-
even do, can I finish? Could we even do what's being proposed on that site if it was a 1-story building?
I
Well,
think we would just need more of a dialogue on
Mhm.
programmatically, what do we vision? Because from an educator's perspective, having third, fourth, and fifth grade on the second floor is just fine, actually. You know, it is common in elementary schools where you have like the older grades upstairs.
Mhm.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that could be a model that we would adopt, that, you know, PK through 2 is on the first floor, but 3, 4, 5 is upstairs. And over at Pumpkin, we have a similar model in that only part of the building is a second floor. So just something more to talk about in
Yeah.
that regard. I
Okay.
think, Mark, JFK can accommodate a little bit more of a widespread footprint, right?
Yeah, and I will caution that there's so many things that go into the site beyond the building. Obviously, green space, playgrounds, fields, if you can accommodate it, but also the parking, the circulation Mike talked about, security. You know, when we're looking at designing schools today, unfortunately, we're looking at much more attention being paid to security. So where cars and how we're separating cars from people and where that traffic's being directed around the site. So you'll hear us talk about, sorry about that, access, where are there roads on two sides or just one side? A lot of things go into looking at the site holistically, which is a bit, gets much more detailed. I think this was just an example of showing that that the ability to take these sites and do, for instance, on JFK, that we'd want to be able to build on this site while still keeping the school operational. And I think that's very much possible.
Right.
And we could get into, later on, as the superintendent was talking about, you develop ed specs, you develop the criteria. We do want to have two playgrounds. We want to have a multi-purpose field. We need this much parking, and that those all have a big impact on how we utilize the site.
Right. So it's interesting that the new build in many cases is a very similar cost to the renovate build, add and reno that you mentioned in scenario 1. I'm guessing it's more, from a cost perspective, it is more efficient to use a 2-story model than a 1-story model because you're not breaking as much, having to dig as much, but
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
okay. Can you so I'm still fuzzy on the renovate as new. So when you're talking about add space and reno for the first scenario, and you talk about like new, what are the limitations? At the end result, when you're talking about the end result, um,
So by state standards, renovate like new means all the systems and materials are brought up to a 20-year life cycle. So new roof, uh, um, the mechanical systems are all brought up. I believe that's what like new means.
okay,
It doesn't necessarily, it's referring to the materials and the systems, not 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 the programmatic fit, right? Or you know, I don't, there are code requirements to improve uh, the efficiency of systems, and that they're more sustainable, but not everything is brought up to absolutely equal to a new building.
and you're limited with, I think we talked about with the middle school piece, the like the ceiling height, you're kind of stuck with the
Yeah,
ceiling height that you have.
yeah, and the structure. So if we really got into it, and I think Mike had alluded to that, if we're building new, we would know every single classroom is going to be 900 square feet. If we're going into an existing building and renovating, that's our target. But the structure, we can't move columns, so there'll be there'll be some variation within that. So
Gotcha.
yeah, there's some limitations when we're doing a renovation.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll just, as we're talking about, and again, these are only the costs here are really, when you think of a rough order of magnitude, meaning they're proportionally aligned. But we're not doing detailed takeoffs, but you get a rough idea. Yes, doing all new construction is relatively bigger upfront expenditure, proportionally not. I don't want to be take lightly the millions of dollars that's represented here, but not a huge difference over many, many years. Um, and again, not taking into consideration that like new buildings are going to perform more efficiently. So there's some life cycle cost savings there as well. But gives you a rough idea of between these two studies. Because as I said, to do really the kind of robust renovation and additions that we would need to get to, the price does start to creep up. Not exactly, but pretty close to what new buildings would be like, and that gets into that FCI figure, right? That's why you start to think, is this really the best approach to do renovation when buildings need that much renovation?
I think at the next portion, you're going to offer kind of a, depending on what we discuss and choose, you would make a suggestion regarding the time frame of how quickly we chose either of them would be what because this is meant to be a 20-year study about approximately. So you would give us phasing of this would be here, this kind of what the,
Do you mean the sequence of?
yes. Yeah.
I think, and please, others chime in here. I think one of the things for a study like this, when we're looking across all the entire district and high school, middle school, is to give you some flexibility. So I think that's why, let's say with the new construction, we wanted to start with JFK and Live Oaks, because that allows you some flexibility in decision making. You don't need to take the building down to do that. And then do you pivot to middle school? Are there high school projects that are happening simultaneously? It's not, there's some choices along the way, right? So that you're not locked into, once you start the first one, there's kind of a domino through the whole thing.
Ms. Doyle, the timeline will be part of the proposed master plan in April.
Thank you for confirming.
So, and again, this, we do have another public engagement focusing on elementary schools coming up on the 30th. So happy to hear feedback, but we're also looking forward to presenting the material in a public forum and allow people to interact and ask questions and get more feedback. So that's what we have this evening. Happy to take more questions or be here to, yeah, if anyone has any thoughts or questions for us.
This is the last slide right now, right? What
Yes,
we're on?
it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have board members with other questions? There's a lot to think about here right now. I'm just looking at my notes. Did you have a ballpark for what would be how many acres for a properly sized elementary school? Did you have that in general?
I don't know that we've if we're starting, if you're starting from scratch, then no
I know
limit.
most of,
Yeah. I'll double check. I was gonna say a number, but
Okay.
I don't want to just say it off the top of my head.
Well, I know, I think most of what we're looking at is in the 10-acre range.
Yeah,
Generally, is that if you were
yeah,
starting over, if
you
you
know
were
what?
starting new, would that be on the low side?
That's probably a little bit on the low side, but again, it has to do with also um, the outdoor program, right?
Right, okay.
Ideally, we'd not just have playgrounds, you'd probably have an outdoor learning space and maybe a multi-purpose field. So there's a lot of things that if you're really just dialing it up from scratch, that would go into it. And frankly, most communities don't have that luxury.
Also depends on the shape of the site, the proportions, the access points, the drop off, the circulation. They don't have elementary schools don't have the student drivers, well, hopefully, and the athletic complexes like a high school and middle school would require, which take up a significant amount of the site. So they could be done, 10 acres or even smaller. Seems absolutely doable.
Thank you. All right, just checking again from board members if anybody has any questions they want to ask at the moment. Certainly, as things come to mind, you can put them in writing. Okay, all right, well, thank you very much for the presentation. And as you said, we do have March 30th is the elementary school public engagement that'll be held at Pumpkin Delight School on at 7 p.m.
Yeah. So similar, we were planning a similar format from, I think most of you were at the middle school one, right? So we'll do a little presentation, probably an abbreviated version of what we did this evening. And then break off into smaller groups or have different stations for people to visit,
Okay,
give us
thank you.
feedback.
Very good. Okay, we do have public comment on the agenda, and I think we do have about 16 attendees. I'm not sure of those people if there are individuals that wanted to make any public comment. So I'm going to read the public comment statement. Speakers may offer objective comments about school operations and programs. The board encourages speakers not to express personal complaints or defamatory comments about Milford Board of Education personnel or any person associated with Milford Public Schools. Security issues and matters relating to negotiations and grievances will not be permitted. Consistent with the principles of the Federal Education Right to Privacy Act, discussion of students is prohibited, absent parental waiver. Public comment does not allow for two-way conversation between speakers and the board. We welcome and appreciate your comments and opinions, and all will be taken into consideration. So just a reminder, the public engagement session that's coming up is the time for questions, or you could email the board. Please note that our meetings are televised and live streamed on YouTube. We do ask that you state your name and address for the record and that you limit your comments to 3 minutes. And public comment is limited to the agenda item, which is elementary schools this evening. Mr. Giancola, can you refresh my memory how members of the public can access public comment?
They now have the ability to raise their hands.
Okay.
And if they'd like to, I can turn them on to allow them to speak.
Okay. So members of the audience, if any of you would like to make public comment, just use the raise hand feature. And Mr. Giancola will activate your microphone. Just give people a few minutes.
Mr. McCarthy, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. And I just need to find out how to do that. That's not doing it.
There we go.
Did that
Yep.
stop sharing?
Yes, it did. Yep. Thank you. Okay, one last call for members of the public that might like to make a public comment.
We have one.
Okay. Who do we have, Mr. Giancola?
Emmy.
Okay. First and last name and your address, please.
Last name's Oake, Oake, 30 Dorinna Place, Milford, Connecticut. And my real name's Mary Elizabeth. M is my nickname. When I attended the meeting last week, or was it the week before, with the plan to do with the middle schools, I noticed on one of the slides, it was saying maybe elementary for the school that would be closed, Harborside. I noticed nothing to do with that with this presentation.
That, I believe, was a suggestion by a member of the public, but it is not part of this presentation right now.
Okay, is it something that would be considered or not?
I would say that during the public engagement piece on the 30th, if people want to make that suggestion, they can do that.
Okay, thank you. That's all it was.
Thank you. Any other members of the public that wish to make any public comment? All right. With that, then I'll close public comment and I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Tedros. It is 8:18 and we will adjourn if there's no objections. Seeing none, we can adjourn. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
All right, everybody.